hello everyone. How is everyone this morning? Good? Okay. I have 30 minutes to give this presentation, but what I thought I would do is spend about 20 of it, or less, speaking, and the remaining portion to be much more interactive, because after all, you didn't come here to hear a talking head. I could have done a webcast, so we'd rather have a conversation. And before I begin, I have 3 requests of you, just 3 requests. First request is that if I say something today that you think is patently wrong, if I say something today that you believe shows my lack of understanding of the CIO or your role, or anything that you find disturbing, I just ask you to hold your suspicion, right? Just hold it for 15, 20 minutes. Let me get through this, and we'll see if we can come around to something that makes sense. Number 2 is, I would greatly request that that we have a very honest conversation today, right? Because otherwise, if we just recite what are known, often events have a lot of cliches, then there's no point us being here. And the third is that if I actually speak past the 20th minute, shut me up, because I have a tendency to talk too much. So these are my 3 requests. I would really, really, really like to thank Indian Express and Dr. Pillai and my friend Kailash for giving me this invitation. I've had a very busy travel schedule. In fact, I was in India just about 3 weeks ago, and I'm back here. And I live in Seattle, Washington, which is home of one of your sponsors, Concur. And I've come here for this event, so I'm a little bit jet lagged. So if I appear to be low energy, I do apologize, right? But let's talk today about the CIO. Who here in this room is a CIO, or the equivalent in your organization? Almost everyone. And how many of you report into a CIO or the equivalent in your organization? Okay. So pretty much the whole room, you're senior technology executives. And I assume most of you are from India and work in India, but have sort of global exposure in your job. I'm going to be speaking today about you and your role, the role of the CIO in the digital age. And the moniker that I'm putting on this idea is the notion of what I call the responsible executive. I find great deal of value, a great deal of convergence on the role of the CIO. And I want you to appreciate my perspective, disagree or agree, but understand that in your office is the future of the business that you work for. And I'm not saying that facetiously. I would not say that at a CEO summit. I'm saying that at a CIO summit because I fully believe in what I'm saying. So why are you listening to me? Well, I'm not a CIO, as you know. I'm a marketer. But I have great empathy for the role of the role of the CIO. I've been working with CIOs for the past 15 years, and I've watched that role grow in importance, but not grow in terms of the respect it's given in the executive circle of most companies. I think like a marketer. I think like a strategist. I do not think like a technologist. So I'm either your best friend or your enemy. You have to decide that. And I will say that if you need any statement of a little bit of credibility, I have the honor of working with, advising, investing in, or being on the board of actually now 31 companies across the world, with some in India, most in the US, and some in Europe as well. So hopefully that gives me some level of credibility on the stage, though I'm not a CIO, and I have long hair, and I wear Nehru jackets and all that stuff, right? Okay, so let's talk about the 2015, and let's review where we are as a community. First of all, technology is in the news all the time. Even the front page of one of the papers today has Nikesh Arora investing 3,000 crores in SoftBank. You read about Google and Apple all the time, and Facebook and Infosys and Cognizant. You don't have to be in the technology industry to understand that technology and the force field created by Silicon Valley is in the news all the time. The consumerization of IT, the fact that each one of us in our different avatars is a consumer and a business person. We clearly see businesses have consumerized, right? They have the business is affected by the consumer use of technology. Every single company I run across has put innovation as one of its core mantras. And they've all tied innovation to technology. Fertilizer companies, clothing companies, technology companies, airlines, hotels, they're all saying the same thing. The IT pro of today, the IT professional of today is, and you decide, is he radically or is she radically different from who he or she was 15 years ago? Or has he basically stayed the same? And my last 3 points, which if I leave you with one kernel of truth here, it's these last 3 points. I believe IT powers the business. I believe IT is the business. But I think IT is massively misunderstood and massively typecast in a very, very, very narrow way. And I see this every place I go. Now, these are things you already know, but it bears repetition. You know, the CIO, if you ask a CIO, what is your role, you get different answers. But one thing is for common, that person is under a great deal of stress. Am I right? It's a very stressful role. Every time the newspaper uses the word disruption or transformation, and you know, in the journalism community, every other article about every company refers to disruptive or transformative. In fact, it's quite annoying because it really doesn't mean very much typically. But disruption and transformation, that falls on your shoulders to actually, you talk about cloud or mobile, you talk about BYOD, mobile device management, mobility in general, consumerization. All of these have become cliches for the rest of us, but for you, it has radically changed your job. Every one of you, I can bet, is tasked with too big a job and given too little resources, too few resources in terms of money and people to actually get that job done, and therefore, you are stressed out. Technology shifts are radically changing the half-life of business. You could make a bet, even 15 years ago, a technology bet, and ride it out for 5, 8, 9, 10 years. Now you don't have that luxury anymore. Most of us can't keep track of all the new things going on. Vendors are good. I've worked for many vendors. I've spent 10 years at Microsoft. Vendors are good, but they're not enough for you because you, by definition, have interoperable hybrid environments, and you have all kinds of things you need to do in which one vendor can never be a pure play trusted advisor. And you have too much on your plate. Now, I've considered all of these axiomatic. Are we together on this? Do we basically believe in these? Because if you don't believe in these axioms, then everything that follows is probably rubbish, right? But if you believe in these axioms, then bear with me. And I did ask you to suspend your disbelief for 15 minutes, didn't I? So all this converges, in my view, on what I call the technology business singularity. I no longer think of the business and the technology team as different things. Sometimes in my writing, I do slip. I still say technology serves the business, business says this. But I believe there's a singularity today. I believe that IT and technology power every single thing. I know that I make my living. Every single thing I do to make my living is powered silently by one of you. Technology is the business. Doesn't mean there aren't other roles. It doesn't mean there aren't other things that you can do in a company. But I believe firmly in this notion of singularity. And that singularity converges on whose shoulders? Yours, the CIO, right? That singularity, the technology business singularity, means that each one of you is not only a technologist, but a business person. If you run IT like a P&L, like some people do, like technology, like TBM would, or ISIL would tell you to do, you're a finance executive, you're a people leader, and you're a corporate strategist. Do you believe me on this? Are you all of these things in your company? Do you think of yourself as all of these things? Nobody's taking me up on that. But anyway, that's my view of the CIO. You're the enabler of outcomes, but you're also the governor of outcomes. Because everybody in the company wants all kinds of things from the technology, but you have to think about security. You have to think about pilferage. You have to think about productivity. So you're given the twin roles, like the god Janus, you have two faces. You're the enabler of everyone in the organization, but when they look at you as a governance body. And you're astride both of those worlds. Your teams are running the business every day, but they're silent. They say that the best IT is silent. If everything runs smoothly, no one even knows that there is an IT department or that there is technology. You have to be creative in your role and efficient. And you have to make really hard decisions every day around where your creativity must end and your efficiency must begin, and when you'll take a leap and take a risk and relegate efficiency to the dustbin as you try to do new things. And as I said earlier, every cliche that most of us in marketing spout out every day actually affects your job. Cloud, mobility, big data, all these things are your job. So I believe the CIO's role can be, should be, will be transformative, whether we like it or not. I believe the CIO is the most important executive in the company today. I truly believe this. If we were to believe what everyone talks about with regard to innovation, with regard to technology, with regard to the role technology can and will play in the world of business, if we believe this, then we must believe that the CIO is the most important executive. The CIO needn't be a celebrity, needn't be all over the newspapers, but that person, he or she, in my view, runs the business. Because if technology and the business are converged, then the person who owns the technology has the biggest effect on the business. This is not to insult other roles. I would be insulting myself if I did that. But I firmly believe the CIO is the most important role. Now, in a sense, I'm asking you to make a leap of faith, right? So I said, if you believe this, then you'll do amazing things. In some sense, you have to believe it, because if you believe it, it empowers you to do the practical things you need to do in order to assume your rightful place in the company that you work for, in the group you work for, or in the next endeavor, whether it's an organization, a nonprofit, an NGO, any organization you work for. So what does this all mean to me? It's really a challenge. And by the way, in the world of marketing, the chief marketing officer has the same set of problems you do, except they're not technology, they're marketing problems. So I think you have to break the chains of conformity. Most CIOs take orders too often. They demand conformity too often. They're hierarchical and not principle-driven, much too often. They are fear-driven. Doing more with less, reporting to the CEO, showing the CEO that every investment has to be justified or there's ROI involved is a fear-driven way to run your team, and it's a fear-driven way, therefore, to run the business. Because if your team is at the core of the business and you are running your team in a myopic fashion, not because you want to, but because you believe you're forced to, then the business itself will suffer. Maybe not today, maybe not in your lifespan in that particular company, but the business will be set up for failure. It'll be set up for slothfulness, not for agility. It'll be set up to run like a sausage machine. What's in, what's out. It won't be set up to be an open, innovative, culturally adept company. Now, I'm guessing, I've had over 2,000 conversations with VPs of IT and CIOs in the last 15 years. And each one of them when you get them alone, will say, I agree with you, Romi, I agree. Some will differ on some things, but I generally agree with you. But then they go back to work and they do the same thing. So philosophically they're aligned, but practically they feel they are not aligned. So here's where the challenge is, which is to adhere to your philosophy and do what you espouse. Because I'm guessing each one of you believes that you should run your teams in a certain way, that you are running the business in some ways, that you are at the core of the change, that in IT today, new product, everything from new product development to efficient operations is the job of IT. Every marketer, every lawyer, every finance person, every salesperson in your company, every ops person in your company, their productivity is fundamentally based on what you provide them. That is certainly true with what I do. Okay? So you have to adhere to your philosophy. So think like a genius would think, right? You probably are familiar with some of these people. Isaac Newton, Carl Friedrich Gauss, Albert Einstein, William Shakespeare. Think like a genius. What would a genius do in this circumstance? He or she would undoubtedly stick to the principle in the face of, Galileo, in the face of the church. Now, he did recant, but that's a side issue, right? There are all these things. You have to think like a genius. And if you think like a genius who believes in the philosophical set of propositions that I've made earlier, right? If you can think like this, if you can think ahead of the curve, if you can convince, if you're not the decision maker in your company, if you can convince that decision maker that you are one of these people, like one of these people, then he or she undoubtedly will bow to your wishes for a short time period. Now, I've given this talk, this is the first time I'm giving this talk, but I've given similar talks to others, and I get a lot of people who say, Romi, you're too utopian. You don't understand what real companies are like. You have no idea what the pressure I work under is. You have no idea how myopic my leadership is. And I say, I believe I have an idea, maybe I don't, but that's all irrelevant. Because the more assertive you are, the more you change that very culture, right, that you bemoan and you admonish in private. So the responsible exec, the CIO, I have a different twist on the notion of who you are responsible to. How many people here are in public companies? Okay, about 10%. And how many of you are in companies that have a broad shareholder base, whether they're public or private? I.e., yeah, quite a few, okay. You hear over and over again that the CIO has to do more with less, has to save money, because ultimately he or she has to do what's right for the shareholder, i.e. the investor in the company. I think that's the exact wrong way. That's the most myopic way to look at your job. I think your responsibilities are to your team, your customers, your partners, and your industry. And if you put them ahead of your shareholders, you will make long-term bets, whether they're technology bets, whether they're culture bets, whether there are bets in which you actually tell the CEO, don't mention the word ROI for 12 months to me. These are the bets. If you think about those four constituents as your core constituents and not your shareholders or your investors, you'll make much more long-term bets. So how do you do this practically? Obviously I'm not with you, and even if I were, I don't know that I would be able to go into your specific company and help transform it. But here's some things. You need to become a bit more like a marketer. It doesn't mean toot your own horn. It means communicate the value of what you do early and often to the rest of the company. See, when salespeople close a big deal, you can't shut them up, right? When a marketer like me even gets some minor thing, I make a big deal out of it. People tweet, and I've got 1 minute, and according to my third rule, I have to be quiet soon, okay? Be philosophy-driven, not hierarchy-driven. Use small teams to create great effect. If you're not hierarchical, if you're philosophical and you imbue and inculcate that philosophy with the rest of your team, you don't need to be a hierarchical leader. You must demand a seat on the board of whatever company you work for. Public companies are a little more difficult. If you're not reporting into a CEO, leave your job. Don't report to anybody but the chief decision maker of the company, not to a finance executive, not to an operations executive. Hire crazy people, not conformists. I am so sick of the typecast, stereotypical view of IT people. IT people are just as creative and zany and zealous as anyone else. Hire amazing people. Gamify the job, make IT fun, and communicate often with your employees, your team, your customers, your partners, and your internal customers as well. So what defines you? The dignity of the role, the stewardship to the entire community and company. Do not be a business person, not a technologist first. Stand up to everyone. Don't deal with nickel and diming. Every CIO feels they're nickel and dimed. And remember that you are the most responsible and important executive in your company. So come on this challenge, please. I exceeded by 23 seconds, I apologize. So I'd love to get questions, interactions. You can throw things at me, you can agree, disagree, but I hope that this was somewhat inspiring, and if not, probably Express will never have me back on stage. So, any questions? Please. I can't read this room. This is a tough room to read.
Hi, I'm Manish Pal from HDFC Bank. My question to you is, you mentioned philosophy, not hierarchy, right? So while hierarchy has its importance and philosophy is where it should be, how do you drive discipline within your team if you hire insane, zealous geniuses and not conformists? You do need people to conform in your team.
Okay, it was a little muffled. I think from what I understood, you asked me, how do you actually hire these insane people and keep them on task?
The discipline piece. So while you mentioned that you do not have to be hierarchy driven,
yeah,
right? Now, if that is from a perspective as an individual when you're dealing with various other teams and the CEO, as you mentioned,
yeah,
maybe that makes sense.
Yeah,
but then you said you don't have to be a conformist-driven leader.
Yeah. Not being hierarchical doesn't mean you're not focused and not directed, okay? Hierarchical is a command and control model that most knowledge workers actually do not like and do not flourish under. So the idea is that if you share an inspirational philosophy with them, and you have clear and focused goals and direction, that the guardrails, the swim lanes, form on their own. That is the key. The most successful CIOs are incredibly inspirational leaders. Many don't know anything about technology, by the way. Many have risen through other ranks. So, but they espouse a philosophy of openness, that the team knows what's happening. In fact, it's interesting, if you ask, many surveys have done, if you ask who actually typically knows the most about a particular technology in a company, it almost always lands on a local internal community leader at a director level. It's never the CIO, which means that you don't know everything, you should learn from others, and you should be hardcore philosophical, but not micromanaging. Right? Small teams do amazing things nowadays because they're enabled to do so. And I believe if we can get out of the mode of the hierarchical CIO, which I will aver is much, much more common here in India than it is in other parts, I would suggest that the CIO will flourish and the team will get far more respect. You actually ultimately represent your team, and that's pretty much it. So that's what I mean by it. Yes, please.
Hi, Prasad. Traditionally, if you see the chief marketing officer, he's been kind of owning up the disruptive approaches to newer business models and activities to bring in profits and various other things. Do you think with the digital driving various things across business, I think that role can be now looked at by a CIO because he helps this disruption across business by re-engineering the processes?
Yeah. You know, if you take marketing, right, which is my profession, most companies' marketing today, okay, or a large part is done through a website, right? It's corporate website, and that corporate website is not owned by the CMO, right? It's owned typically by a different team or a CIO. In other words, ultimately the convergence point is the technology, and therefore the CIO is involved in all kinds of business. It has to make trade-offs all the time about what he or she enables and what he or she doesn't. One small little thing that I learned is very, very useful is that if the CIO demands that his team sits in the team meetings of other parts of the company, so there should always be a representative of the CIO or IT at the marketing, at the sales meeting, at the finance meeting, and so on and so forth, and then vice versa. A marketer, a sales, they should also go to the IT team meeting, okay? And you learn what the constraints are on that person, right? So I think some cross-pollination outside of these silos is very, very important. And frankly, it's very rare that companies do that and put it in action. But the ones that do flourish. They have one conversation typically, right? So a CIO does look at all parts of the business, but is not considered in the common sort of perception that he or she is enabling all the different parts of the business. So that has to change. If the CIO will assume the rightful place in the organization that I believe the CIO should have. Yeah. Any other questions, comments? Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Samir from Videocon D2H, and I just want to kind of differ with one of the statements that you made at the start of your talk, which is that CIOs are now, they still have a backseat in many of the interactions they have with business and with the executive group. I think with the disruptive technologies that are now, coming out and with this huge digital transformation that's taking place, increasingly the executive group, the board, and everybody else is kind of realizing that CIOs are playing an important role. And I think that is changing, at least out here, I feel, in India.
Yeah. Okay, so I think the point was that I made a statement that the CIO isn't given enough visibility and respect, and you disagree with that. And I would say that as an executive, many CIOs still don't report in to the CEO. Many CEIOs are not given board seats where I believe they should be. So, there are obviously counterexamples, but my sense is that this should be an 80% statement, not a 20% statement. Second, we're in an era of celebrity CEOs, right? You can name CEOs of all kinds of companies, but the CIO is typically known only in his or her fraternity. And I believe that's a big mistake. I believe that the CIO, even if he or she doesn't like fanfare, needs to be accorded a certain amount of respect in the organization because that person is a business decision maker. That person does make decisions that are fundamental to the future. So I would like that the pendulum, it's come some way, but it goes further. So it's just a matter of degree, perhaps. Yeah. Any other questions or comments? And fine, disagreements are great. Yes, please.
So hi, I'm Amit. So there's a lot of discussions happening around a term which has been in the market, which is Chief Digital Officer. Right?
Chief Digital Officer.
Digital Officer,
yeah.
Right. Where do you see the overlap between, the role of a Chief Digital Officer and a CIO? I mean, most of it, whatever you showed us, is a part of the portfolio of a conventional Chief Digital Officer.
Yeah, I'm not a big believer in the role of Chief Digital Officer, and I'll tell you why. Digitization is a thing that needs to be in the warp and the woof of the entire company. So it's like saying, 20 years ago that you might have a chief fax officer, right? Or a chief telegraph officer. I mean, these things don't make a lot of sense to me. The whole company has to be infused with digitization. If you're referring to digital when it comes to marketing, then it's just another channel, right? You don't have a chief newsletter officer and a chief email officer. You have a chief marketing officer. So I've never found that term particularly useful. I think it obscures much more than it clarifies. No doubt that there are Gartner and Forrester and Aberdeen have all written a great deal about the CDO. But for me personally, it's not a role that actually has boundaries and doesn't own anything. And it's in fact a role that should be part of the culture and again, the substance of the entire company. So I'm not a big fan of that, personally. Yeah. And by the way, none of my companies that I'm involved with has a chief digital officer. So, well, I'm given a big 0000, so I think I'm done. I really enjoyed having this conversation with you all. I'd love to speak with you later, and thank you very much for listening. So.